unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to unSILOed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Mark Johnson, who is, I guess now, emeritus professor of philosophy at the University of Oregon and the author of, and co-author of many books. I guess the classic is Metaphors We Live By, which you wrote with George Lakoff, my colleague here at UC Berkeley. And I was just looking at this and I realized this was published in 1980.
Yes,
oh my God.
believe it or not.
That is so long ago.
Yeah.
But it's I was going back through it and it's still so incredibly fresh and it does not need any revision. It's pretty awesome. Then there's this book that came out, and I guess it was 99, Philosophy in the Flesh, which is, I mean, it is a magnum opus. Pretty amazing.
I always say it's a book that could stop a 45 slug or hold the door open. It's heavy. It's heavy reading.
It is, but it's worth it, and it covers a lot of ground. But then there's others. There's moral imagination. There's the meaning of the body. And then I've got these more recent books, Embodied Mind, Meaning and Reason, How Our Bodies Give Rise to Understanding, the Aesthetics of Meaning and Thought, Bodily Roots of Philosophy, Science, Morality, and Art. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you.
So, I mean, you talk in the books, well, a lot of the books, about the co-evolution of philosophy and science. And,
Yes.
you know, this has been going on for a long time. I mean, I remember I studied intellectual history. And, you know, when you study intellectual history, you're sort of standing outside of these disciplines and you can see how they feed off of each other.
Yes, right.
And I think if we were to tell the story of this coevolution in the 20th century, I think your name would have to be in there as one of the protagonists. And I think that aspect of philosophy and the sciences that you're most interested in is the relationship between philosophy and cognitive science. And you talk about there being these two generations. The first generation is the one that sort of dominated in the 20th century, and you studied it in school. You know, interestingly, Dewey and James have more in common, I think, with the second generation than the first generation. So we might have to go back. Might have to go back in time and talk about kind of where we went wrong. Yeah. But this first generation was, was one that was disembodied. I think that's how you describe it. You call it metaphysical realism. And I want to dig into that, both the philosophy and the psychology. But what I find interesting is that it seems like all of the developments of this second generation of cognitive science that you've been involved in, it somehow has passed the world of artificial intelligence. Somehow, like the world of artificial intelligence seems to still be working from this notion of cognition that you have long since sort of superseded. So I don't know where we can start. Maybe we can start by going back to when you were in school. You said you studied philosophy and then you kind of got disenchanted by it.
Yes.
Before you just stumbled on this. Yeah.
I was this kid in Kansas, in eastern Kansas, and I know nothing, but aspiring to learn things. And I ended up I went off and I got a philosophy major and an English major at the University of Kansas. And I thought I was going to get a math major. And then I took differential equations. And I said, I don't think I'm going to be a math major. So I went off to the University of Chicago for graduate study. This was back in the 1970s. Everything was dominated by what was then called, it still is by some, analytic philosophy, or linguistic philosophy was another way of describing it. And the fundamental assumption of that field was that all thought and all meaning is mediated by language. So if there's any clearly worked out thought, it should be expressible in literal terms in language. And so in philosophy, because you had people trained to do analysis and rigorous logical, inquiry and that sort of thing, they viewed themselves as patting themselves on the back and like, so we're going to tell you what knowledge is, and your field doesn't have anything to offer us, but we're gonna lay it on you. And it was all linguistic. And I have to tell you, from the beginning, that never. I mean, I could appreciate the wonders of human language, and I got interested in speech act theory, and so there was a distance to go there. But basically, the view, that view of language as um, mediated by propositions, and then the propositions were, had a subject and a predicate, and then they mapped onto the world, and that's how you got real knowledge. That never worked for me, I have to say. And some of my fellow graduate students probably said that's because you're not, good enough at logic. But at any rate, um, uh, I ended up doing my doctoral dissertation on metaphor. And I began to see that metaphor played a central role in everything we do, how we think, where our values come from. And this was just, at the time, this was in some circles unthinkable, and in others just not interested, and right. And so, strangely enough, I got invited out to Berkeley to do a visiting professorship for 6 months in 1979. And the first day I was out there, I met George Lakoff, and we realized we both had this view about metaphors being fundamental for all human thought. And that started us off in a different direction. And so, and I'll just say, for a long time, we were using linguistic metaphor, as the basis for our arguments and as the evidence. So I was just talking to someone this morning as a massage therapist, and she was talking about, your shoulders take your responsibility. Well, we have a metaphor that, you carry your responsibility and that sort of thing. And people would say, well, that's just a metaphor, a figure of speech, but it's a metaphor, and it's part of a large, system of metaphors. And basically, you couldn't think the way we do without metaphor. So we started pushing that view and using mostly evidence from language. But as it went on, we realized that we had to pay attention, and this is in the 70s and into the early 80s, that there was all this wonderful new work coming out in the new field of cognitive science, which didn't exist until then. And so we realized that we had to approach this stuff scientifically too. Okay. And I don't know, bear with me for just a moment, but I'll say something about the coevolution. The idea was that philosophy doesn't lead the sciences around by the nose and tell them what to do. It can provide insight into their fundamental assumptions. It can provide critique. It can elaborate and all. But it needs to pay attention to the best empirical, work on meaning, on language, on identity, on values, whatever your topic is. And the idea is that since and this we argued in many places on independent grounds, since there's no absolute knowledge, the best we humans can do is to have multiple methods of empirical inquiry and to see where the evidence converges. And the idea of the coevolution of philosophy and science that's a phrase that Patricia Churchland introduced in 1986 in her book, Neurophilosophy. And that caught on, and it just seemed right to me, so it's not that any one field has control over, has the right answer. That's not the way to think about it. But on the other hand, it's not just it's not all relative. That is, there are ways of bringing evidence to bear, raising critique. The sciences have been good models of those, with some exceptions. And so it would be a coevolution would just be a kind of obvious natural thing to do, is to make the most of the sciences you've got. And I would say, make the most of the arts. make the most of insight into human meaning and thought and values and that sort of thing. And so from early on, at first, when we were doing language, we were saying linguistics is a science. Okay. And so it has evidence. It recognizes patterns, and explains why those patterns are the way they are, that sort of thing. So that naturally led to, well, you can't just, it's not just linguistics, but what is psychology telling us? Developmental psychology, does it reveal some of these same things? And where's the converging evidence? And then that eventually led into all this work on embodiment, and that led into looking at the neuroscience of it. So all of that is a coevolution and ongoing conversation between the sciences and philosophy and other human activities of inquiry.
So, among the philosophers, right, starting with Frege, and I guess going through A.J. Ayer and so forth. I mean, what was their view of metaphor? I mean, how did they make sense of metaphor?
Yeah. So I did a book called Philosophical Perspectives on Metaphor, and it was the only, because I was fascinated with metaphor, and I wanted one place someone could go to find out what philosophers said about metaphor. And I realized that there was almost nothing that they said. It was shocking. And what they said was they dismissed it because, like, Frege was a primary example of this. Basically, all of these founders of the analytic tradition were still objectivist in their views. They thought they were trying to give knowledge a firm foundation. And the way to do that was through propositions that mapped onto the state of affairs or didn't, and if it mapped on, then you had truth and reference. And so those were the key terms. And I went, one of the world's most famous Frege scholars was at the University of Chicago. And my dissertation advisor said, you should go talk to Leonard Linsky, because he's the famous Frege guy, and see what he says about metaphor. And I went into his office and I asked him about that, Frege, and he just looked at me for several seconds. And he said, I don't think he had anything to say about that. So, and then he said, well, maybe there's one place where he talks about the emotional coloring of a word, and maybe that's, but there was no place there. It wasn't neat. The idea was, if there's any meaning that's valuable in a metaphor, if there is any, many people thought there was no semantic content. But the idea was, if there's any meaning, well, it has to be literal meaning. So a metaphor would just be what you learned in sort of grades, primary school. It's just like, oh, it's a comparison using, that either using like or as or doesn't use like or as. And so I'm telling you, metaphor didn't become a philosopher's topic until the late 70s. There was a conference at the University of Illinois, and they brought Donald Davidson and John Searle and a bunch of other people who had finally written something on metaphor for this conference, and it got published in this big volume. And then it was a topic. But not until then.
Now, what's the relationship between metaphor and embodiment? Because your work is on both of these things.
Yeah, George and our theory is called conceptual metaphor theory. We called it that because we didn't want to give up the notion of thought and conceptualization and rigor to people who, were objectivists. So we wanted to say conceptualization is much richer and broader than you can imagine. And so as we were working out all of these metaphors, and I have to say a word about this. A metaphor is we called it a complex mapping of structure from a source domain to, like, say, understanding is seeing. We would call that a conceptual metaphor. The source domain is seeing, and the target domain you want to understand is understanding. And so you say, I see what you mean. That was a very clear enunciation of your position.
Or time is money. Time is money.
Yeah. So you have, But what we discovered when as we were writing Metaphors We Live By, was that the source domains were tied, they were always more concrete than the target domains, and that they were tied up with aspects of our embodiment. And we did it sort of simultaneously in 1987. I published The Body and the Mind, and George published Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things.
Yeah,
And we,
remember that.
and then in the book you held up earlier, Philosophy in the Flesh in '99, that was our attempt to, in one place, bring together all the research we were familiar with from these different fields that showed the fundamental role of the body in everything we experience, in everything we imagine, everything we think, everything we do. And so we wanted this to be, you know, a go-to sort of place to see this research. And we were fortunate, we got in on the first wave of metaphor theory, and we were fortunate to be part of the first wave of embodied cognition theory, which is what we call our view. And I'll just say, this may come up later, but it to me, philosophically, I had been troubled by dualism my entire career, and I think it's built into our cultural understandings, and it leads to all sorts of not so good things. So I've been looking for a non-dualistic, naturalistic account of things. And that's where, if you're going to do that, you have to see meaning coming out of our embodied engagement with an environment. Even though the environment is physical, it's interpersonal, and it's cultural. So we have to mix all that in there. But embodiment, and it makes sense. We're born into an environment. We learn the meaning of things, not conceptually, not language yet, but babies are, and then toddlers are beginning to learn the meaning of their world, the affordances of their world. So that started us off on the central role of the body. And then that later, you couldn't talk about the body, and now it just seems so obvious, without neuroscience. You have to understand that. So I would put it this way: the fundamental unit of experience, or of anything you do or think, the fundamental unit is a human brain, at least partially functioning, operating a human body, at least partially functioning, as it engages in an ongoing way it's an environment which is at once material, interpersonal, and cultural. That's a nugget of what everything we're doing is about and trying to articulate. So embodiment all the way through. And now that we have all these information processing models and all, I mean, sometimes questions get raised about, well, are we going to do away with the body and all of that? But that you have to build up to that. I joked in one of my papers that when I was in graduate school, nobody had bodies, and I said, that's because nobody's work besides Merleau-Ponty.
You talked about the body snatchers.
Yeah, I say that it's the body snatchers. They deny the role of the body, with a few exceptions, like Merleau-Ponty and Heidegger, and then Dewey and James. My favorites. And so it's like I say, then finally we discovered that we have bodies. And we're working our way into realizing that those bodies are central to meaning. And we don't know how far this is going to take us. But I think only through a kind of emergence theory, where higher level functions, what we call higher, emerge out of lower level functions, do we get a non-dualistic account. So I've been attracted to people trying to develop those naturalistic theories of mind and of language and of thought.
Yeah, it's amazing how even in one of my fields, which is finance, people talk about, the stock market going up and down.
Yes.
Right? I'm like, where is it going
we
up
use
to?
that as an example somewhere.
Right?
Lakoff
Yeah.
and I, yeah.
It's
Right.
amazing. But
And I mean, and it's intuitive, and we want to say that you learned these metaphors, not that you could articulate them, but when we articulate them for you, you say, "Oh yeah, yeah, that's why we
right.
say, the stock market fell, it plummeted, we're on a precipice now, and it makes sense that I mean, the technical term is." Um, acceptation. Lower level processes of motor movement and perception are exapted evolutionarily for higher level functions. And to me, that's the only way you can avoid having a radically dualistic picture, is to see it as an emergence view. Um, and
Yeah, you
and
talk
and
about the
so
seven
the
E's, right?
metaphors, yeah. Pardon?
You talk about the seven E's, right? One of which is,
Yeah, that's
evolution,
right.
right?
Um, Yeah, and so in contemporary, in like over the last 15 years or so, people have started talking about the four E's. That was and there's there, these Oxford companions to X. They now have an Oxford companion to four E's. Okay, and the four E's are, the thought, meaning, etc., are embodied. They're embedded, meaning there's no separation from the environment. You're always in an environment. They're inactive, meaning that you enact meaning. You don't just stand back and represent it. It's an active engagement with the world that generates meaning. And extended. And extended means that we've offloaded some of our cognitive processes and tasks onto things in the environment. Call them tools, if you will. And so I kind of playfully argued that there are more E's, and instead of so there's embodied, embedded, enacted, and extended, and then I wanted to say there's evolutionary and exaptative. You could say those are one, because exaptation is just a process by which evolution operates, um, or just process it's generated evolutionarily. And so evolutionary and meaning is emotional. That's a big one I wanted to add. And then another part of my view that has developed over the last 10 or 15 years is that all of this is about aesthetics.
Mhm.
And that opens up a number of issues, but I needed another E. So I'm looking at Dewey's work, and he uses the English spelling of aesthetics,
Mhm.
which is ESTHETIC. So we use it AE, So if I got my eighth E, which was aesthetics of meaning, and I
Well,
said, maybe there's some other E's. Let me know when you find them. But that's it shows you just how rich all this is. And those eight E's kind of capture some of the main themes of this embodied cognition view.
well, and of course, analytical philosophy has nothing to say about aesthetics or about,
Yeah.
um,
I,
moral philosophy or about meaning.
now they would vehemently object. I agree with you. But so when I was in graduate school, they used to be, I could be made fun of, he said, because the real philosophers were the ones who did what? Logic, that's rigorous. And epistemology, or theory of knowledge, that's really rigorous and maybe scientific. So they thought that the value fields, as they called them, were tied to the emotions, so that there was a thing called the embodied theory of meaning and embodied theory of value and emotivist ethics. And so it was, oh, we have two basic functions. There's the representative function, that's real knowledge generating, it's cognitive. And then there's feelings, and those are just emotional responses, but there's no cognitive dimension to them. And so they could just dismiss that. They could say, we're interested in truth, we're interested in, logical structure and blah, blah, blah. And so I think that was the nadir of kind of um, philosophical analysis, when in the 40s, 50s into the 60s still, and maybe even beyond. It's like ethics had to be recovered from that. And aesthetics never. So aesthetics was at the bottom. Ethics, at least, might have something to do about your behavior, but aesthetics, that's just emotional contagion and communication. And my first job I got because I taught aesthetics. I learned aesthetics with Ted Cohen, analytic aesthetics that you're talking about. And it's, yeah, let me put it this way, it was a very thin gruel. It wasn't real meaty.
Mhm.
um, but it opened my eyes because I'm saying now that all these embodied dimensions are aesthetic dimensions of our experience. And so that aesthetics should be the exemplary a basis for an account of meaning. So what I'm saying is I'm trying to turn that tradition on its head. I use this, as you may remember, as a kind of joke, but from Gospel of Mark, it says the stone that was cast out shall become the cornerstone of the new kingdom, or whatever. I've forgotten the phrase, but I said, so that was the kingdom of God in the gospel, but we have a different one. We say that um, the the field of the body and the aesthetics of the body is the basis, is the cornerstone that was rejected, but will now become the cornerstone of the new building, the new philosophy of experience, that sort of thing. So this is still very much an ongoing thing. Um, and just a small group of us introduced this aesthetic um, focus um, over the last 15 years or so.
Well, look, I mean, everyone will acknowledge that mind is just what the brain does, right? So everyone will acknowledge some, what you call, I think, a trivial form of embodiment, right? That there is
Mm-hmm.
physical stuff sitting at the basis of all thought. But I mean, your claims are much more substantial than that,
Yes.
right? That
Oh, yes.
your body is what shapes your concepts at the basic level, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, by the way, um, I I don't think that the mind is the brain. I'm a Deweyite. My great hero is John Dewey, and the mind is the brain in a body, in acting in an environment. It takes all of those things. And it's sort of easy to forget that, because if you say the brain, well, the brain has to be in an environment that's giving it input and affecting output and that sort of thing.
It can't be in a vat. Yeah.
No, I mean, that's a kind of, yeah, right. I mean, that of course that was a famous, example to push that view. But if you read that article, "A Brain in the Vat," it was meant to say that we need a count of embodiment, but that's all it did. It didn't give any examples of it. It was too early. And for Hillary Putnam, I talked to him about this, and he said, "I know you guys are probably right about metaphor, but I just don't want to think about it." He was one of the few analytic philosophers who was beginning to take embodiment seriously, but it didn't show up it showed up by him saying, well, you see, the body really matters, but he didn't have a lot of examples. He didn't draw on any research on that. And so, um, analytic philosophers thought, wow, this is a philosopher of embodiment. But I would have said, well, no, it's just within analytic philosophy, he just opened the door to begin to look into this. So you're right. Um, the claim is that the body that is not just a recording and representational device, it is enacting our world. And I want to introduce the term from J.J. Gibson, the perceptual psychologist, that's now pretty famous. But it's affordances. And Gibson would say, look, so the affordances are what, given a creature with a certain kind of body, with certain functional capacities, the environment affords certain things, and not others. So there's a seagrass out on the Oregon coast, and I seen a slug climb up it. So for that slug, it affords climb up ability. But for me, it only is stomp on ability,
Mhm.
A chair affords sit on ability, but not for an elephant. Now, that's so obvious. But my theory of meaning is built around the fact that the meaning of something is the affordances that it enacts. And that there's a complicated story to tell about that. But intuitively, it makes, you grow into a world where you learn the meaning of things by what it affords you by way of experience. And you learn that thing might burn you, and that hurts. And that thing affords, ouchability, or however you want to say it. So we're saying that it's embodiment at the deepest level. So we're saying that logic is embodied, is a set of bodily processes. And the embodied cognition view on this, now I'm drawing on Dewey's pragmatism. Dewey says, look, our biological, there are patterns of biological interaction or inaction with the environment. Those are the affordances that, and those patterns of inquiry, they're like patterns of inquiry because the organism is trying to find food. It's trying to avoid predators. And so there is not consciously reflexive, but there is response to patterns of affordances. And we're saying so inquiry, it consists of need, an organism being in a state of need, a search process to try to resolve the difficulty that gave rise to the need, and the third stage of it is satisfaction. And so we're saying that's a basic structure of animal inquiry. Need gets the animal going and directed towards something, a process of search, and hopefully the problematic situation that gave rise to the need can get dealt with in some more or less satisfactory way. So we're saying need, search, satisfaction, or I'm saying, is the same structure of our ordinary abstract conceptualization, and it's the same structure of scientific method. Okay, so it's embodiment from the very deepest levels of our engagement with the environment, all the way up to our highest abstract occupations in the sciences and the arts. So yes, it's being all the way down and all the way.
Well, maybe we can talk a bit about this, first wave of cognitive science, because I
Oh
think
yeah,
that seems to have a view of the mind as a computational device, right, to some degree.
yes,
And there are a lot of people that
yeah,
would say we have computers that are capable of engaging in all sorts of what we might think of as mental activities, and yet they are disembodied, right?
yeah,
Um, and so what's wrong with that view? I mean, what are the affordances of a
yeah,
microprocessor, right? That doesn't
yeah.
even make
Right,
sense.
right. Yeah. What we called first generation cognitive science was this linguistically oriented notion. And so it drew on Chomskyan linguistics, so that, you had innate structures that were generating, grammatical structure, et cetera. They were universal, and then you had rules to get down to specific languages and all of that. Um, so there was Chomskyan linguistics. There was cognitive psychology, which at that time in the 60s and 70s was doing information processing. It was early information processing models. Even if you had a black box, it was still some sort of processing, but was more sophisticated than that. So this view in its purest form, no, everything turns out to be computational. So information theory and information processing theory has profound achievements and insights, and so that could fit in with first gen. I mean, that could be some of it, but notice when you move from just information processing to human and animal information processing, then all other things come into play, and I think that's where the fight's going on. So let me tell you how uncertain I am about all this, because yesterday I'm just finished a book with a neuroscientist, Don Tucker, and we've written another book together called Out of the Cave earlier, and we got to know each other and we're all excited. He said, in your work on embodiment, I've got the neuroscience that can back this up and all that. So the latest book we wrote is called Deep Feelings. And so we felt that feelings had not and emotions hadn't been taken seriously except by people like Antonio Damasio, the neuroscientist, and Gerald Edelman and Jerome Feldman there in Berkeley. But mostly feelings, the central role of feelings hadn't been brought into play. So we wrote this entire book trying to emphasize the fundamental role of these deep feelings. And they start with arousal, and then they move into these paths of motive control. Like one of them is a kind of a feeling of elation, and the other one's a feeling of anxiety. And we tried to show how all these affective dimensions are absolutely crucial to what we select out to pay attention to, and so, all right. We were both very excited that we had some discoveries along the way, and we're still waiting to hear whether MIT will publish this. But Don sends me an email, and he says he's been working on all of these information processing models, and in terms of active inference. I don't know if people know, most people know about this, but just briefly, it's seeing us as projecting animals project expectations, what will come in this context. And then if what we projected is met with adequately by, if that adequately captures the situation as experienced, then we go on, hey, that's good. The world's my oyster, as we say. But if you run into what we project are expectations, if they are challenged by our environment, then we instead of elation, our kind of sense of satisfaction or pleasure, we get anxiety. And don't we all know it? And pragmatist philosophers, if this worked meshed so well with them, because they said that doubt is not an intellectual state; it's a feeling of uncertainty about the situation you're in. And so Don and I had done all this. Well, he wrote me and said he'd been working intensely for months and even years, but it just now come together on these affective inference models. And he says, I think we've got information models that will make the body that don't require the body. And I fell over. I literally fell over my chair. It's like, Don, oh my goodness, my whole life of working on this, it would be flushed out. Now I know what happens when there's a paradigm shift. Why people are so resistant to as Thomas Kuhn said, a paradigm shift. But so we're going to have a Zoom meeting in 2 days and talk this out. He sent me other stuff saying, no, I'm not throwing out embodiment work. But what I want to talk to him about is, what is the necessity of the limbic system? What is the necessity of these affective, emotional dimensions? Because that's where motivation comes from. That's where we take the measure of how things are going for us, as I just mentioned, et cetera. So I'm not up enough on the neuroscience of it, and the computational stuff. I'm not good at that. So it's I he is, and he keeps sending me these remarkable things. So I wonder, I don't know where it will go,
Well, so I mean, so
Um,
the claim could either be that these disembodied machines can't know and understand the world, or it's that they just can't know and understand our world, right?
yeah, the way we do it too. Yeah. So, I mean, that's what I was thinking about. That's one way to deal with this. Our bodies evolved to engage certain kinds of environments, and so, and as part of that was all of this elaborate, emotional, um, component and processing.
Mhm.
Um, and so there's the joy and wonder of unpacking that and seeing how it makes sense of some of the things we do, and how there's thinking fast and thinking slow, and those sorts of things. Yeah, but w- honestly, I don't know what to say about a certain information processing model. Um, it doesn't seem to me that there is affect or emotionality in the way that humans use it. So I mean, I just don't know what that means. So Don, I'm hoping Don will enlighten me.
Well, with respect to understanding the world, I mean, you write a lot about causation and causal models,
Yeah,
and
yes.
I think a lot of people in the world of artificial intelligence would agree that when it comes to understanding causation, there's a long way to go, right? And the humans kind of have the edge here, right?
Hmm.
So why
Hmm.
is it that we are so good at crafting causal models?
Yeah. Well, I have a very simplistic, maybe too simplistic answer, but I mean, the efficacy of those models and the method that I'm at need search satisfaction, and the use of looking for convergent evidence, and putting one's work before critical communities of inquirers, those things matter because they fit us ultimately, I want to say, for some kinds of actions in the environment, but we have to see what's being served here, and almost every time, even almost every time you hear people who know something about this, they always end by saying, "But look, humans have to be careful now. We have a role in this, and blah blah blah." But I think that John Dewey said, look, that a mind should require a body to reason is not surprising when you think that the whole bodily person grew up in an environment in which it must be somewhat adapted, or it couldn't survive. And so there is an issue of survivability and growth of meaning, I want to say, that um, that causal explanations play a critical role in. But note this. Um, I've said whenever I've talked about causation, and Lakoff and I analyzed all these 21 or so causation metaphors to say there's not just one conception of causation. Here are 21 or 19, and some of them are really used in various sciences. But I want to bring in one other element, and that's narrative. Um, there's and I this is stuff I did a lot of work with Paul Ricoeur on narrative, his 3 volumes, Time and Narrative, and narratives are also, they're not causal stories. They embed causation in some ways, but they're so wonderful for structuring human meaning because they have things like agency, and they have environment that you act in, and they have history, and they have relations, and they have conflict and resolution of conflict, and all these things that are so important and meaningful in our lives. And narratives attract us I mean, because they do address those. And so I want to say it's, you know, and this is straight John Dewey, that causal models are wondrously important for us, but so is narrative. And you can't, I mean, and it depends on what you're, causal models aren't very good at telling us the meaning of things. And we are meaning making and meaning seeking creatures. And narrative is much more powerful at that, I believe. And now that in saying what things are meaningful, science can play a critical role, and it should be paid attention to, I'm saying. But I'm also enamored of the role of narrative in human life, um, which explains various, mythos of this, that, and the other, and why are we attracted? What there are generic narrative structures, and of course those can be programmed into, to process certain things. But causal models, and there's a causal models. The causal models we analyze have what's called radial category structure. That's a term from George Lakoff's Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things. And so there's like prototypical causation was a billiard ball, and then there's action at a distance, and that's further out. It's still causation, but and so there is not one uniform, adequate account of causation that we can be searching for, I want to say.
Yeah, I was teaching my class just the other day, and I was asking a student to explain a phenomenon, and he said, "Well, it's clear. It's a ripple effect." And I said, "Well,
Oh, yeah, yeah,
that's not a causal model.
yeah.
I mean, it's not a causal story. I mean, it is a
Yeah.
story. It kind of
It is a
helps
story.
to
Well,
yeah
it's not one that has been proved, but it has maybe some place in. I mean, if
yeah
you think of light waves, I mean, it there's something there. Okay,
yeah. It's the
but
start
I
of it.
just want
It's
to
the
say
start of an
it's
explanation.
yeah, yeah. That's a start. That's a start. I think that's a good way to put that.
Well, certainly in my teaching, I've spent a long time trying to figure out what exactly it is that I do, and I realized that what I do is I tell stories and use metaphors,
Ah,
and that's all you do. And if you run into a student of mine, let's say, or most teachers, 20 years later, you ask them what they remember,
mhm.
they'll typically remember the stories and the metaphors, and
Yeah.
not
No,
much else.
Yeah, I was talking to a colleague of mine, and since I used to teach philosophy 101 to 300 students, and now I don't like the way this is going, but now it's like you can't get them to read a book, or you gotta yeah, and so um and you have to stop class and let them do little exercises and group work and all this. And so I said, well, I guess, it's out with the old, in with the new. And he said, but Mark, what students reported about your 101 class is that you told great stories. It's just what you said. That's what they remember, because they are the stories of our lives, loss and love and excitement and danger, I mean, and narrative orders the meaning of those things, and we relate to them in profound ways. And so I I I I think it's not a bad thing if you could be, you're thought of in terms of great, insightful stories. um, Goes a long way.
I mean, you talk about how there's a role for the empirical in philosophy, right? And I'm thinking back to William James. Was
Okay.
he a philosopher? Was he a psychologist? Who
Yes.
knows, right?
Yeah.
It was sort of arbitrary. He had to pick one department over the other.
Yeah,
I
that's
mean,
right. They actually were creating philosophy departments in his day. They didn't exist, and then they didn't have graduate programs till like 1895 or something. I don't know when it was. That don't quote me on that, but yeah. But James and Dewey are my heroes because they both understood this coevolution of science and philosophy, and they were both psychologists, but they were trained as philosophers. And James wrote the famous Principles of Psychology. which he said made him nauseous when he finished it. It was the most bloated piece of junk, but it's amazing, wonderful piece of work. And Dewey was president of the American Philosophical Association and the American Psychological Association at two different times. So these are the people who are models, and they both have something, not to say so much about at an abstract level about narrative, but about the importance of narrative in life. They both, and they both, and so I was so attracted to them because even in people who do pragmatist thought and who like Dewey and James and Peirce and Jane Addams and on and on and on and on, scores of others, but some of these early classical ones, a lot of them don't kind of want the science in there. There's this like, well, it's going to be reductivist or, and I don't know. So James and Dewey are exemplars of what I call an empirically responsible philosophy. And they were both, especially James, doing the research and then trying to put it all together and this with his amazing mind. I just it it's mind blowing, really. I have to say, but I regard them as kind of showing us the way that we can blend our science and other modes of understanding.
And so do you think we are sort of heading back in that direction? I mean, you wrote about Richard Rorty, and I remember, when I was in school, Richard Rorty was sort of the sort of, pinnacle of right,
Yes,
philosophy and language.
philosophy and the mirror
Um,
of nature. Oh
yeah.
yeah.
I mean, are we heading back to sort of a new pragmatism, do you think, in the world
Okay.
of
Yeah.
philosophy?
Well, see, that's my hope. Okay. Is it happening? Well, we'll see.
Because
Um,
I mean, he considered
but
himself a pragmatist.
he
So
did,
is
but
this?
Rorty didn't have the embodiment side.
Mhm.
You might say he cared about pain and suffering, and he wanted kindness and all of that. But Rorty does not pay serious attention to science. He has examples that he just mentions in passing. That was just not his thing. So he, though he's so let me just say, there's a kind of, I shouldn't call this a battle, but there is a contestation in pragmatist thought today, and it's between what are called the linguistic pragmatists and the experiential pragmatists. And this experience, I'm an experiential pragmatist in the sense that I think that all philosophy and all thought and all action and all values emerge in experience, which is not reducible. It's a rich experience, and that we have to, through inquiry, remake that experience to move forward in the world. And the other group was influenced heavily by Rorty. And that's the group that we call that linguistic pragmatism or neo-pragmatism today. And they still bought into and buy into the centrality of language. That's why I call it linguistic pragmatism. And so you won't find, I don't know of a single place. Now, I haven't read everything Rorty ever wrote, but I've never seen him give any serious account of embodiment. I've never seen him have any extensive treatment. But now, I mean, of science. But now there, this, um, it's growing. I don't, I'm optimistic, but anxious. There's a field, a growing field where people are doing this naturalist, dimension, and they're paying attention to the scientists. And so, this 1925 is the 100th anniversary of the publication of Dewey's Experience in Nature, and they're doing this, so they're doing a volume on that, celebrating that. And so the piece that I wrote for that says that this may sound absurd, but Dewey's the greatest philosopher in the 20th century. And I said, people have thought that's absurd, but my real view is that he's the greatest philosopher of all time. Uh,
Mm.
it, because of his ability to blend these so many different approaches. I mean, there is no other philosopher that I've ever known of that has the breadth of John Dewey. I mean, he talked about metaphysics, law. He wrote extensive books on metaphysics, language, logic, education, art, politics, democracy, values, morality. I mean, on and on. And so this is my idea of what we should strive for. I mean, we can't be experts in those fields, and sometimes we're going to make fools of ourselves, but we should strive for that kind of openness. Um, some people said James was too open. That because he spent time, he thought dealing with different, like mystical things, and that some people want to dismiss, and but he was just amazing in his openness to give a view a chance. He always said, if it makes a difference positively in people's lives, well, it's playing some role there. We better figure out what's happening there. I believe there is, over the last maybe 10 years, maybe a little bit more, there's a growing body of people who are emphasizing the experiential, and they tend to be the ones who bring in the science side of it. But there's this that new wave of linguistic pragmatism. What it's still doing, it's the idea that we don't need to do metaphysics. See, because they reject absolutism. And they think if you reject absolutism, then you can't have any foundations of any sort. And we're saying, no, 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 they're not the bad kind of foundations. They're saying there's no good foundation. There's no foundations.
Mhm.
It's just, and so we analyze structures of language and meaning, and that's what we do. And I'm saying if you do that, you're missing out on the very sources of meaning and value. That's my
Yeah.
prejudice.
Well, yeah. I mean, you talk about this radical objectivism and this radical subjectivism, and how
Subject,
you're
yes.
sort of sitting somewhere in the middle. Well, if philosophy and psychology are starting to talk to each other and work together in this way, I still don't see a rapprochement between the humanities and the sciences. It seems like the subjectivism has kind of dug itself deeper into the humanities, and the objectivism has dug itself deeper into the sciences.
Yeah, I just think that's true because, well, I don't know the reasons. So I think there's some reasons. One is, um, there's a prejudice against the humanities for mushiness, and because they try to take into consideration all of these incredible complexities of experience. All right, and there is no ultimate method for doing this. However, I'm a believer. I mean, I think that in terms of need, search, satisfaction, there are many forms of searching, you know, and narrative accounts are one, but not the only one. And so, but I think you're right. And years ago, I was in a reading group with at another university with historians and psychologists and philosophers, and we we at that time we read some of Rorty's work, and and like some of them were just outraged, that when there was too much relativism in that, and there's not method, and so I think that whole, and then I don't know if this is true or not, but doing good science is so difficult, so labor intensive, so time consuming, and so expensive, that it kind of fills up your world, I want to say. And they don't see the same rigor in what they regard as the humanities, you know? And I just, so the best I can do with that is try to bring research out of the humanities and help it interface. But it's not even clear just how to do that or what that would mean. I probably spend more time trying to show why the science is relevant
Mhm.
to, if you want to call philosophy, humanities. I do. Why it's relevant. That in itself is a huge challenge because there's a knee-jerk reaction about reductionism, really. And I think there's a kind of, there's an anxiety in the humanities anyway. Um, you know, that those departments aren't growing. And it's sort of like the kiss of death when it becomes the Department of Philosophy and Religious Studies and History. I mean, all those things. I mean, it's like, oh well, we just lump all those together in the humanities. Um, I regret that that's people's attitude. Each of those areas has methods and traditions to work out of and insights. And I think the most important thing I ever learned from Paul Ricoeur was that all of these approaches and can speak to us in some way. So I thought, well, there's the model I have to pursue. And then like I said, when I got in graduate school, that's not what was going on. But now, um, you know, some of that is going on.
Well, so in last question, in one of your books, you recounted John Searle's famous, right, Chinese box story,
Oh yeah,
and there's a lot of talk in the world of artificial intelligence about creating, um, robots, chatbots, AI
yeah,
systems that can relate to us and think like us and feel like us
yeah,
and so on. And a lot of people would say that when they have these conversations with their ChatGPT, it's really just a Chinese box, right? And that they don't
uh-huh,
actually have
yeah,
any
yeah,
understanding. What would it take? I mean, would we want to create these Boston Dynamics type robots and have them navigate the world
yeah,
and reproduce and so
yeah,
forth if we wanted to find these artificial companions that we could actually communicate with
yeah,
and relate to?
yeah. But yeah, well, those things are here. So what are we going to do with them, right? But I mean, I've sort of said my piece in a sense. I don't think that there's an experience of something as meaningful there.
Mhm.
And my work is focused around the nature of meaning, where it comes from, how it develops, and blah blah blah. um, and I don't see it there and I was listening to these bots today that my colleague Don Tucker sent me. They were really amazing. And it was funny because it was a man and a woman, and they had been, in a sense, programmed to, he says something, she says something, and then he responds to what but it felt, it was natural enough, because then she'd say, so that means that so and so, but there could not be something said without this response. I mean, it was locked into that. You don't always need an immediate response to that, but that's just something that one would tune up, right? um, so um, and honestly, I don't know. I personally don't see value. I mean, values are not propositional. Values are emerged from the nature of the body and the environment, and different for different animals and different environments, I want to say. And but that's what they're, that's the new frontier for some of this. I guess if I see something good happening there, I'll have to eat humble pie. Um, and
Well, we'll
again,
have
since I don't do these models myself, I just read about them from others. So like I said, I'm sort of out of my depth.
Well, we'll have to have an update at some point and figure out whether these things are
Yeah.
indeed
You know what?
fulfilling that
It's
promise.
people, I have friends who get very uneasy about all this, you know? I and that and uh, feel that something's going to be taken over or taken away, or you know. And so I understand some of that sentiment. You know, that feels like there's a challenge here. You know, our history of our species, or all these. We realize we're not the center of the universe. We realize we're not the only animal. Now we realize, boy, rationality isn't what we thought it was, and it's not what it's cracked up to be. Blah blah blah. Anyway, thanks, Greg,
Yeah.
for
Well,
the opportunity to chat.
well, it was a great opportunity for me to go back and reread some of these wonderful books that I read a long time ago, like Metaphors We Live By, Philosophy and the Flesh, Meaning of the Body, and of course, a couple new ones that are coming out. Thanks so much, Mark.
Thank you.
unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.